morning. I'd like to go ahead and welcome and start today's webinar. It's 11 a.m. Eastern, so as those filter in, we'll go ahead and get started. This session is being recorded, so if you like to replay, rewatch, or send this to someone else, it'll be available via YouTube or an ACMA member, and we'll be able to send those out. Again, welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And those of you, those familiar faces who have joined us previously, welcome back. My name is Kiana Dixson, and I am the Life Sciences Associate and Pharmacist here at the ACMA. We at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, we have a mission, and that's to establish a higher level of global independent standards of excellence across the board throughout the pharmaceutical environment and also within medical affairs. With the recent release of our board-certified Biologics and Biosimilars Specialist Program to further advance the knowledge of these products, this afternoon we will be discussing Biologics and Biosimilars Interchangeability with two leaders within the biosimilars industry. We have Sonia Oskouei and Sarah Ikenberry. Today, our presenters on this topic, again, they're leaders in the industry, and I'll go ahead and give the floor to them. We'd love to hear more about how you have landed into this space. Sonia, I'll let you go ahead and go first.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kiana, and I appreciate everybody joining this session. As Kiana mentioned, I'm Sonia Oskouei. I'm Vice President of Biosimilars at Cardinal Health. So I lead the enterprise-wide biosimilar strategy on behalf of the network that we serve, which includes life science companies, providers, pharmacies, and of course, most importantly, patients. I am also a pharmacist by background, like Kiana. I've been leading U.S. biosimilar strategies now for over 7 years in various roles and organizations. It's an area that I feel very passionate about just because I believe in the promise of these agents, which is centered around patients and around affordability and accessibility of critical biologic treatments. So thrilled to be here today with you all to talk more about some of the key foundational concepts associated with these products and tackle some misperceptions that are out there that could lead to misinformation. And who better to do this webinar with literally the source of truth, with Sarah from the FDA. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you for introductions.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Kiana. I'm also happy to be here today. I'm a senior communication advisor at FDA's Office of Therapeutics, Biologics and Biosimilars, where I'm responsible for all the education and outreach related to biosimilars for the Food and Drug Administration. And I'm also very excited to be able to talk about biosimilars. They're also a passion of mine, like they are for Sonia, and to provide information about what they are and what they aren't, and all of the other other things that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you both. So this afternoon, what should you expect? Sarah and Sonia will lead the discussion of biologics and biosimilars by first introducing and laying the foundation of what these products are with Biologics and Biosimilars 101. They will then go into the science and substitution of the interchangeable biosimilars, specifically in the US, and what this means for providers. We will discuss the myths and those misconceptions of biosimilars that are common among providers and patients. And then we'll also briefly review those international standards of biosimilar interchangeability in comparison to those in the US. At the end, we will wrap up with questions and answers. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A section of your Zoom, and we will address those at the end. These questions, they can be specifically for either Sonia or Sarah. Any additional questions that you may have referring to the ACMA or any resources that we have will be answered directly to those inquiring. With that, I will now give the floor to Sarah to go ahead and kick us off with those biological products 101. Oh, Sarah, you're muted.
I am muted. Here we go. Okay. So in this section, I'm going to cover the key points about biologics, including biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars, differences and similarities between biosimilars and generics, and the approval pathway for biosimilars in the US. Next slide. So what are biologics? Biologics are medications made from or in living sources, such as bacteria, yeast, and animal cells. They are generally large, complex molecules, and their structures are generally more complex than other medications. So as a result, biologics are often more complicated to purify, process, and manufacture. And there are many types of biologics approved for use in the United States, such as monoclonal antibodies, insulin, vaccines, and allergenic products. So there are three key definitions related to biologic products that we will discuss today, including reference biologics, biosimilars, and interchangeable biosimilars. Next slide, Kiana. So first, I'm going to explain a little bit about the approval pathway for original biologics, also called the 351A pathway, or the standalone biologics license application. So for standalone products, the goal is to establish from scratch the safety and efficacy of their new product for each indication. And that data package is largely based on those big pivotal clinical trials, represented by the larger top blue portion of the pyramid. A reference product is a biological product that has been approved in a standalone application, or 351A, and that contains all data to demonstrate the product's safety and effectiveness for each of the indications being sought by the manufacturer, and is the product against which a proposed biosimilar is evaluated. Next slide. So a biosimilar is a biologic medication that is highly similar to and has no clinically meaningful differences from an FDA-approved biologic we were just talking about, a reference product. So compared with reference product, biosimilars are made with the same type of living sources, are given to patients the same way, and have the same strength, dosage, potential treatment benefits, and potential side effects as the reference product. Next slide. So FDA approves biosimilars through an abbreviated pathway called the 351K pathway, shown in this image. The goal of biosimilar development is to demonstrate biosimilarity between the proposed biosimilar and its reference product, not to independently establish the safety and effectiveness of the proposed biosimilar. So this generally means that biosimilar manufacturers do not need to conduct as many expensive and lengthy clinical trials. So for biosimilars, they meet standards by a different set of studies than a reference product does because the goals are different. Biosimilars show that they are like the reference product in a stepwise fashion, and a body of evidence is built based on extensive comparisons. So for biosimilars, there's no one study that definitively demonstrates biosimilarity. Instead, we're looking at the totality of all the evidence across various sources of information. And so the biosimilar pathway is abbreviated because the amount of clinical data needed is less than if the standalone pathway was pursued for the same product. And that's important because big clinical studies are expensive to run. And so for biosimilars, there's scientific basis that supports a more limited clinical comparison. And the hope is that this abbreviation results in a lower cost of development. However, that doesn't mean the science is less rigorous. Extensive analytical comparisons make up the foundation of the biosimilar development programs, which is shown here on the bottom of the pyramid. This is because analytical studies are generally more sensitive than clinical studies in detecting differences should they exist. So a product that's highly similar with respect to structure and function to the reference product should behave like the reference product clinically. In addition, there's some types of clinical assessments that's used to demonstrate that there are no clinically meaningful differences. FDA typically expects PK to be compared between the biosimilar, and sorry, that's pharmacokinetic, or PK to be compared between the biosimilar and the reference product. And in some cases, a study in patients to compare efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity. But these studies are not considered in the same way as pivotal phase 3 studies in a standalone development. And it's not shown here, but I just want to point out that the quality standards that biosimilars must meet are not abbreviated. And both reference and biosimilars are subject to the same standards. Next slide, Kiana. So an interchangeable is a biosimilar product. So it meets the two standards noted for biosimilars, highly similar, no clinically meaningful differences from a reference product, and it meets additional requirements. So in addition to the data to support biosimilarity, an interchangeable biosimilar undergoes additional scientific evaluation to support automatic substitution at the pharmacy. This data is to reassure that switching between a proposed interchangeable and reference is okay. And so, for example, in some select cases, a study may be conducted to show that switching between the proposed interchangeable and reference is no different than using the reference without switching. However, I will point out that of the 4 interchangeable products approved by FDA, only 1 has been required to submit the switching study data. Slide 9. So in sum, reference biologics, biosimilars, and interchangeable biosimilars are all biological products. And so now on the next slide, excuse me, I just want to pose, is it myth or fact? A biosimilar is the generic of a reference biologic. Okay, let's find out. It's a myth. While this is a helpful frame of reference for understanding biosimilars, because biosimilars and generics are both versions of FDA approved medications, and they both may offer more affordable treatment options to patients, biosimilars are technically not generics. They are approved through different abbreviated pathways. And the next slide will show a diagram that highlights the differences between generics and biosimilars. But the main difference between them is that the active ingredients of generic drugs are generally smaller, simpler, and more straightforward to copy, while biologics generally cannot be copied exactly, excuse me, because the molecules are larger and more complex, and usually contain a mix of many slight variations of a protein. And so the mix can never exactly be the same in each dose or batch. And this is true of the reference biologic and the biosimilar. So the information needed to demonstrate biosimilarity can be much more extensive than what is needed for a generic. And that's why they are approved under different approval pathways. And the next slide details the 2 main drug approval pathways in the United States. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the Public Health Services Act, or PHSA. So small molecule drugs and generics are regulated under the FDC Act, while biologics, including biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars, are regulated under the PHS Act. You can see here the new drug applications and biologic applications require a full data package to show the safety and efficacy for all indications. And under generics, it says it's identical to an already approved product and which needs bioequivalence data for approval, while biosimilars are highly similar and they need the data showing that there's an absence of clinically meaningful differences to an already approved biologic. And so now I'm going to focus on some practical considerations for providers when prescribing and or dispensing biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilars. So on the next slide, some considerations are that both biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilars can be used in patients who have previously been treated with a reference product, i.e. treatment experienced, as well as patients who have not previously received the reference product, also called treatment naive. Biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars are expected to have the same kind and amount of immunogenic responses as their reference product. For example, if a patient does not respond to the reference product or lost their response because of anti-drug antibodies, then using a biosimilar or interchangeable biosimilar to that reference product would not likely be helpful. Next slide. So one of the key points that I want to make in this webinar is that healthcare providers do not need to wait for a biosimilar to be approved as an interchangeable biosimilar to prescribe it. FDA does not approve a product as interchangeable unless a manufacturer specifically seeks an interchangeability determination. Biosimilars are as safe and as effective as the reference product as they were compared to, just like the interchangeable biosimilar. So an interchangeable biosimilar is not safer than a biosimilar. And healthcare providers can generally prescribe biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars just as they would prescribe other medications. But FDA-approved interchangeable biosimilars may be substituted for the reference product without the intervention of the prescribing healthcare provider, subject to state laws. And these state laws that address substitution of biologics at the pharmacy level vary. Therefore, it is important for prescribers and pharmacists to understand the pharmacy practices in their state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to talk about common misconceptions and other information.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you. I know there's a lot of stuff going around. So to even push through it while not feeling the best, that was fantastic. So I appreciate that. And so we're going to go through some myths and facts and trying to talk through some of the scenarios. And we do want to leave enough time for questions so we can have robust discussion. But although the type of information that Sarah went through is really the facts around biosimilars, and in some therapeutic areas, it's probably more familiar, for example, in oncology, where our first biosimilar approval in the US was in oncology since 2015, we still see misperceptions around these concepts. And as we get into additional therapeutic areas, like ophthalmology, diabetes, and we're going to continue to expand, new stakeholder groups are being exposed to biosimilars for the first time. And so these concepts are so important to get down early as we get more and more of these agents coming to market, so we could really maximize the value associated with biosimilars. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So the first myth or fact question: all biosimilars are interchangeable in the US. And Sarah did such a phenomenal job speaking through this. Hopefully you all know the answer right away. But if we go to the next slide for the answer. So this is absolutely a myth. And I think what Sarah said towards the end of her section is really important, that interchangeability is sought after by the manufacturer. It's not like there's the group of biosimilars that seek approval and then the FDA determines, well, this one's that, and this one's interchangeable and this one's not. That is not how it works. So it's really important to note the process and really the implications. And like Sarah said, there is not a clinical association with this designation. It is a regulatory terminology that's unique to the US. And so as a brief update of where we are, we have now 40 FDA approved biosimilars. 4 of them, we now have 4 interchangeable biosimilars, again, sought after by the manufacturers. 2 of them are for insulin products. One's an adalimumab or Humira biosimilar, and one's a retina biosimilar. But again, I think it's important to understand, because of the implications of this designation, it's going to be most relevant for those agents that are naturally dispensed by pharmacies and pharmacists. So a lot of more of the pharmacy benefit type of products would make more sense for this designation, since it allows pharmacy level substitution per state law. If we go to the next, thank you. Myth or fact question: biosimilars that are interchangeable are better than non-interchangeable biosimilars. This is actually still a misperception that is out there in the market, and Cardinal does market research, and there's market research out there that reveals that there is the perception that sometimes interchangeable biosimilars may be better or have some clinical superiority than those. And if we reveal the answer here, which hopefully you all know very well now, is that is a myth. One of my favorite statements that the FDA puts out is that healthcare providers can be just as confident in the safety, efficacy, purity, and performance of a biosimilar, whether it has interchangeability designation or not, as they do with the reference product. And that's really important to note. All right, next one. Biosimilars have not resulted in significant savings to the US healthcare system. So this actually comes up a lot in terms of a debate of how impactful are these agents being really. When we look at the various statistics around this, it's actually really impressive around the savings that we've already derived from biosimilars. And so there's a lot of opportunity. And so when we think about how are biosimilars driving savings, it's by multiple paths. On average, biosimilars are launching the market around 30% off the list price of the originator biologic. So directly by coming in as lower cost agents, there's cost savings opportunities. But what you also see, especially in certain molecule types, when you have competition come into the market, the originator product or the reference biologic price can also drop to continue competing with the biosimilars. So you'll see average sales price or Medicare ASP go down for certain molecules pretty much in parallel with the biosimilars. So there's multiple ways that cost savings is derived by having healthy competition in the market. And what you see with a lot of originator products, often you'll see price increases year after year if there is no competition. So again, multiple benefits of having a healthy competitive market. I will add though, what's important around the healthcare savings point is making sure that savings ultimately reach the most critical stakeholder, which is, of course, patients at the end of the day. We know there's healthcare savings to the US healthcare system and different stakeholders, but in order to ensure a long-term sustainable biosimilars market, we do need to make sure that the savings are felt to the most critical stakeholder, being patients. So the AAM, or the Association of Accessible Medicines, recently in September put an updated report out, which is great, with a lot of great statistics and facts around savings and the impact of biosimilars. And the latest statistics shared were that biosimilars have generated more than $13 billion in savings since 2015. and they have been used in more than 364 million patient days of therapy. And this last part is what's really exciting about these agents too, in addition to the savings, is that it's resulted in more than 150 million incremental days of therapy, meaning patients who may not have been able to access or get the treatment sooner in the treatment paradigm because of various barriers or restrictions, which may be cost related, were able to access these treatments. So really exciting to see the promise of biosimilars delivered already, since we've had our first one in 2015 in the US, but there is certainly opportunity to have more and much more. And if we look at the pipeline, there are multiple assets and additional candidates submitted to the FDA, being reviewed by the FDA to bring more biosimilar competition for additional originator products. In fact, if we look at by 2026, the number of biologics facing biosimilar competition should more than double than what we have today. So really important and exciting to see the pipeline. And when you think about originator biologics in the US, they have, when they're approved through the FDA, they have 12 years of market exclusivity, which is the most that I know of anywhere in the world. But once that exclusivity period ends, given if there's no patent extensions, that gives them an additional exclusivity period, you're really opening up the door for biosimilar competition to come in the market. So hopefully we'll continue to see this pipeline of biosimilar assets being developed as exclusivity periods end for these originator biologics. So a lot of opportunity there, and a lot of statistics around the potential of savings around biosimilars. We've seen estimates that say savings from biosimilars could exceed $100 billion in aggregate within the next few years. So really exciting potential here. The next slide. So we're going to really end the session of content looking at briefly the international experience with biosimilars, which is important to look at. So if we go to the next slide, one thing I do want to note for those that may be newer to the space is that the US is not leading the way. I will say that when it comes to biosimilars. If anything, the EU has been leaders in the biosimilars market with several years of biosimilar experience, more than 15 years now. And this statement was put out by the EMA, which is a very powerful statement. They put this out a few years ago, saying that over the last 10 years, the EU monitoring system for safety concerns has not identified any relevant difference in the nature, severity, or frequency of adverse effects between biosimilars and their reference medicines. I mean, powerful statement for a lot of years of use of biosimilars. So what I would say is key here in this information is that biosimilars are not a brand new treatment product that we're just being exposed to the first time. If anything, I would consider US stakeholders fortunate to also have this robust international experience and data and real world evidence to leverage to help support, equip various stakeholders with developing clinical confidence in these agents and acceptance and adoption in the US market. So really exciting to see this type of experience and strong experience with positive outcomes with biosimilars. Go to the next slide. So since we've been talking about interchangeability, which is such a big topic, an important one, we do want to look at what is some differences between the US and the international standards across the EU. Of course, the EU, as a reminder, the European Union is not one country, so there are variations between the member states. But to reiterate, in the US, in the FDA, interchangeability is the only country that has interchangeability as a regulatory designation. And of course, as we talked about, it's a federal regulatory designation, but the purview or the implementation of it is regulated by the state level. So each state's board of pharmacy will have their rules and regulations associated with interchangeability. Now, majority of the states do enable that, I'll say, automatic pharmacist substitution, but you'll have some states, a handful, that say it's enabled, but only if it results in lower costs to the patients, or there's a few that might have different implications associated to it. And many of the variations by state is also associated with more logistics with implementing interchangeability. So there might be different requirements for documentation or communication and what that looks like. So this is where Cardinal Health put out an interactive state map for interchangeability state laws, which is very useful, that you can look at each of your state's board of pharmacy rules for related to interchangeability. Now in the EU and the EMA, really exciting advancements here, because again, it's unlike the US, where interchangeability is used as a regulatory term, interchangeability is really used more as the concept of switching between products in the EU and EMA. And very recently, there was a joint statement by the EMA and HMA. So EMA is European Medicines Agency. HMA is the Head of Medicines Agency, where basically state once a biosimilar is approved in the EU, it is interchangeable. And the way they're using the term interchangeable is that it refers to the possibility of exchanging one medication for another medicine that is expected to have the same clinical effect, which from a clinical perspective is spot on to what a biosimilar is, right? As Sarah has been talking through. What's even more interesting and I would say exciting about the statement recently put out is the phrase that they said here, in the gray box, a biosimilar can be used instead of its reference product or vice versa, or one biosimilar can be replaced with another biosimilar of the same reference product. And this is a scenario that we're seeing more and more, even in the US, as we have more biosimilars come to market for the same reference product, there's more questions even coming up around, all right, we're starting to understand and feel comfortable between switching a biosimilar and an originator product. But now we have more scenarios where we may be being asked to switch from biosimilar to a different biosimilar based on the managed care landscape and so forth. So this statement, the joint statement that says even between biosimilars for the same originator product is really helpful to see based on the experience, the broad experience in the international market, which includes switching between biosimilars. And so, of course, like I mentioned, there are multiple countries and member states of the EU, and each one may have different operational considerations or rules associated with this designation. But again, very powerful statement by the EMA and HMA to put that out to help clarify. So wealth of information and data from the EU with over 2 billion patient days of therapy. So if we go to the next slide. So that wraps up really the main content that we want to go through foundationally and bust some myths, I guess, out there associated with these products. But Kiana, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, and you're on mute.
Here we go. Hopefully you can hear me. There we go. All right, so thanks, Sonia. Thanks, Sarah. I learned a lot already within just these few slides that we've been over today. And I think a lot of our attendees also learned a lot because a lot of questions have come in. So I'll go ahead and go through these questions, and either of you feel free to jump in and add into your expertise. So the first question that came in is, what are the goals of biosimilars if it's a reference of a biologic? If patients can take a certain biologic and it's effective, why go the biosimilar route?
Well, I can start off with that. The major goals of having biosimilars and of the Biosimilars Price Competition and Innovation Act, which is what sort of created the ability for FDA to approve these products, are increasing access to patients and lower cost. And so biologics are the most expensive drugs, that we have in the U.S. And until the BPCI Act was passed in I think it was passed in 2009, or maybe it was signed in 2010. But there was no competition at all for biologic products for biosimilars, and so they had to create the pathway and create the ability for FDA to be able to approve these products. And so the whole point is to increase access and lower cost, just like generics were created in the 80s.
And Sarah, if I could add to that too, and another exciting promise of these agents, which is in the terminology of the Act of Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act, is really around innovation too. So as you're able to bring more competition and lower costs and increase access, all the good we want to see, what you're doing is reducing the expenditure and the amount of the healthcare dollar that we use that's consumed by these biologics that haven't had competition for many years. And by doing so, you're enabling greater investment in the next generation of therapies that we want to see that have even better and more improved outcomes than the biologics we have on the market today, especially as we're looking at advanced therapies with cell and gene therapy, more targeted precision medicine. So very exciting promise that biosimilars can serve as a catalyst for.
Thank you. All right, so the next question I see here, do we know if wholesalers generally will substitute an order with a biosimilar if the biologic is out of stock, or are those orders considered fill or kill?
So I'm not sure if I follow the last part, but I guess I could speak to kind of the dynamics today around these products. Of course, it's going to depend on the company the individual works with from a wholesaler or distribution standpoint. But what's important to note today in the market, these biosimilars are almost acting or performing like brand products. And that is because of the way they have to commercialize and market and really compete against originator products. And really all the different stakeholders are influencing how these are managed. So when you look at the managed care landscape and payers and PBMs on how they're evaluating biosimilars thus far, it is not the generic model. Now, I think as we get more and more products come to market, to Sarah's point, I mean, the attention behind bringing more competition is with the same promise that generics did. So today, the substitution, the auto substitution, because of state laws of interchangeability and all that, it would have to depend on the product. So there's probably not a strong ability to do that today. However, if the market evolves and we get more designations of interchangeability, it's pharmacist level substitution, and it's something that's dispensed at the pharmacy, maybe that's something we can move more towards. But again, I think it's an evolving topic that's going to be managed by the individual organization and wholesaler being worked with.
So Sonia, I know you touched on this briefly actually, but another question came in. Do biologics get the same patent protection, i.e. the number of years of protection as chemical pharmaceuticals?
Sarah, do you want to start off that one or do you want me to? Exclusivity period?
Well, the answer is biologics get more, they get more exclusivity. Maybe Sonia, you're probably better able to speak to that.
Sure.
Topic.
Yeah, so exclusivity period, biologics get greater years. So that's 12 years of exclusivity in the US. I think the second highest that I've heard with biologics has been 10 years in different countries. But what's important to note is exclusivity is almost different than, or it can be extended based on patents. And so this is what we were talking about. So even though the US gets 12 years of market exclusivity as a biologic, we see originator biologics have patents associated with the product. This could be based on the device, so whether it's citrate-free, what buffer it's using, these different characteristics that can extend exclusivity periods. And that is very much the case on what we're seeing with the big market event in 2023 with the adalimumab biosimilar. So Humira is going to be facing competition for the first time in 20 years. So it's been on the market without competition for 20 years. And what's extended Humira for beyond that 12 years that biologics got has been the patent protections for various attributes. So that is something that occurs. I would say another example that's probably the most extreme that I'm familiar with today in the biosimilars world is for etanercept or Enbrel originator biologic, where there are FDA approved biosimilars. However, those will likely not launch until 2029. And what that means is that originator product would be on the market for over 30 years without competition. So it can be a really big challenge with delaying these products from coming to market. And I'll say it's also the source of a lot of advocacy or policy discussions as well. Last year, there's a bipartisan law passed around that was called the Ensuring Innovation Act. And that was really focused on making sure any amount of exclusivity granted to a product was based on true innovation and not for the purpose of just delaying competition or creating mechanisms to delay competition. So when these things happen, I would say it's also, there's a lot of policy and advocacy efforts around these types of scenarios to make sure patients can access these treatments as soon as possible.
Thanks, Sonia. That's great. I think this is a really good question as a follow-up to that. What resources are available to help with biosimilars education?
Well, the FDA has many resources available to educate both healthcare providers and patients. On our website, which is, you could just Google FDA and biosimilars, but it's www.fda.gov/biosimilars. And we have infographics and some content for patients. And we'll be having more soon coming in the winter for patients. For healthcare providers, we have a lot of resources. We have fact sheets, and then we have an entire curriculum toolkit that can be used for academic institutions to teach about biosimilar interchangeables or other groups that would like to learn about biosimilar interchangeables. So it's a more in-depth look at the scientific and regulatory concepts about them.
And I would say those resources are fantastic and they're only as good as they are used. So I do highly recommend checking out FDA's website. This is an area where they really do have a wealth of information. I lean on it quite a bit, and many stakeholders lean on it quite a bit, just because of the misinformation out there. It's no better place to get the information from. So I do highly recommend it.
In addition to, here from the standpoint of the ACMA, the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, we actually just released last week a board certification specifically for biologics and biosimilars. So I suggest you to check that out as well. I have a question here. Is the immunogenicity study mandatory for all biosimilars?
So the FDA definitely looks at immunogenicity for any product that comes into the agency, biosimilar, biologic, et cetera. But interchangeables, some of them have to do the switching study, and that's where you switch multiple times between the reference and the biosimilar to make sure there's no immunogenic concerns. But it's not mandatory. Even for interchangeable products, it can be waived if there's scientific justification to show that it's not needed. I will say that if FDA has any concerns with immunogenicity, whether it's biosimilar or interchangeable, they wouldn't approve it.
Here's one about the EMA, about the international standards. How does the EMA stance on biosimilar interchangeability influence or impact FDA's current stance on biosimilar interchangeability in the US?
So it's really, even though we're using similar terms, they are specific statutory terms for each of our countries. And so they mean different things, even though they sound like they mean the same things. And I think Sonia was explaining some of that, but it is really complicated and confusing. So I mean, as far as I know, Europe doesn't have automatic substitution. They don't have substitution at the pharmacy without notifying the physician. And so what they mean by interchangeable is the product can be used in place of the reference product. And so we believe that both biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars can be used in place of reference product in the United States. They're safe and effective for that. So we, are happy that EMA put out that statement, and it's nice. But again, it's sort of not analogous to the interchangeable in the US. And so it doesn't really impact like how we're interpreting our laws or the laws that we have to uphold.
And Sarah, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I won't speak out of turn, given you're the pro at this. But I know even with BsUFA 3 release and the regulatory science pilot initiative, there is heightened attention, it feels, from the FDA to leverage more and more data sources to support regulatory decision making, including real world evidence. And there's some mentioning about even looking at international data for regulatory or data efficiencies and data sharing. So it seems like there's more and more interest around doing that. Would that be correct, Sarah?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely interest in learning about all of these different ways that we can get information about biosimilars and interchangeables and be flexible to help with development and to also help, make sure that people feel like, everything's scientifically justified and supported.
Let's see if you can answer this question. Can you please give an example of known products that work between biologics, biosimilars, and interchangeables? How was the treatment results of each product?
I'm not sure I'm following. Sarah, do you?
I think they're asking about what the treatment results are between like a biosimilar, interchangeable, and a reference product. I'm not sure I can really comprehensively answer that. I do know, there's a lot of different examples of, if you look at insulin, there's reference products, and then there's biosimilar insulin, and there's interchangeable insulin. And you can always find information about the studies that go into the approval process on our website, Drugs at FDA. If you look that up, it does have the reviews. And so you can get an in-depth look at the different data that was submitted for approval. Now they do redact some of that since it's proprietary information, but it can definitely be a wealth of information if you want to take a deep dive.
I think that's a really good resource. So here with that, I like to thank Sonia and I like to thank Sarah both for joining and giving all of their insights and their knowledge in this rapidly growing area. Thank you to all of our participants for participating and joining today's webinar. And if you have any further questions, you can always connect with us directly on our website here, medicalaffairsspecialist.org, or you can email us directly, info@acmainfo.org. If you have further questions for our panelists today, we can try and direct those to Sarah and Sonia, and we'll get back with you. With that, I'll go ahead and end the webinar. The recording will stop. And if you need the recording, please reach out to us and we'll be glad to send that out. Thank you.
Thank you all.